You're listening to A Radio.
Unfortunately, Brexit has not only created an opening to reinvent the EU, it has also aggravated two looming dangers.
We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds.
Thank you for joining us. You are listening to A Radio, and this is the Morning Moment. We're on weekdays, 11:45 Eastern. Follow us on Spreaker.com and click on the like button. I want you to listen to this clip. It's from the Glenn Beck Show, November 15, 2019. Now, I must emphasise, this is just part of what he has to say on this subject. And believe me, he has a lot to say. But I wanted you to hear this short clip to emphasise that Soros is interfering, that's putting it nicely, with Americans' First Amendment. And, I might add, while Glenn Beck has been more than outspoken about Soros and his somewhat dubious activities, it still continues. Here's that clip, and all my clips from here will be on my site as usual.
George Soros, number one man, came to my number one man, or number two guy at the time, number one on television, and threatened us, 11 years ago? And I didn't understand it until Ukraine broke. Mm-hmm. He said, you tell your employee what your employer is doing is hurting Mr. Soros, and it's going to stop. No, it's not going to stop. Mr. Beck has a right to voice his opinion about your boss. Well, it's going to stop. You don't understand. It's hurting Mr. Soros. You don't understand. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press. If he said something incorrect, we will correct that. But you got to give us the details on what's incorrect. That's when he said, you tell your boss the ship has already been built and sailed. And you're either on that ship or you're not. When my guy said back to him, I can tell you right now, I don't need to tell that to Mr. Beck. Mr. Beck will say he doesn't want to be anywhere near your ship. Now, that's what happened 11 years ago. And you want to know what ship had been built and what has already set sail? Then watch Wednesday's special. I didn't even realize it until we were deep into it. That's what he meant. And it has nothing to do. I won the Defender of Israel Award. The presentation was given to me by Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. I'm anti-Semitic? No, I'm not afraid of you, Mr. Soros. And more people need to stand up. All these Democrats who, as Stu just said, these rich people that control, George Soros and our State Department have formed a hydra. And they're not alone. And they are setting the world on fire. The New York Times, you people are so blind. Today, they did this whole story about how the civil society groups have just stood up, spontaneous, and they set Chile on fire. No, it was the State Department and George Soros. Look it up. Go to glennbeck.com and just look up the Hydra show, because all of the evidence is there. George Soros, a written memo that was leaked, a written memo to the State Department from George Soros himself, not his organization, from him. It's anti-Semitic to say this is what the man said he's doing and how he's doing it? Insanity. Stop with this. Stop before it's too late and people start to die.
Now, at long last, even This has risen to the attention of the Prime Minister of the UK, Boris Johnson, who believes he is involved either directly or indirectly in interfering with the internal debate leading up to the national referendum on Brexit, in which it is believed, but it is being investigated, that Soros attempted to sway the Brexit campaign to vote no, which would have resulted in the UK staying in the EU, which is clearly preferable to Mr. Soros. Here's a clip that will emphasise that quite nicely.
Unfortunately, Brexit has not only created an opening to reinvent the EU, it has also aggravated two looming dangers. First, it unleashed a crisis in the financial markets, comparable in severity only to 2007-8. This has been unfolding in slow motion, but Brexit is accelerating it. It's likely to reinforce the deflationary trends that were already prevalent. The Eurozone has been lagging in the global recovery because of restrictive fiscal policies. Now it has to contend with an impending slowdown. The orthodoxy of German policymakers stands in the way of the only effective response, having a Eurozone budget that could adopt counter-cyclical policies. Meanwhile, the banking system of continental Europe has not recovered from the earlier crisis. It will now be severely tested. We know what needs to be done. Unfortunately, political and ideological disagreements within the Eurozone have stood in the way of using the ESM as a backstop for banks as well as sovereigns. Second, the EU faces growing military threats. Our external enemies have been emboldened, posing new, as yet unfathomable dangers in various parts of the wider region that are also liable to aggravate the refugee crisis. It's against this background that I propose to discuss the refugee crisis with special emphasis on the financial needs it presents. I won't address the human rights and development issues for lack of time, but I discussed them in the written remarks submitted to the various committees.
Now this next piece is from the Daily Mail newspaper, November 9, 2019. Tories called for an urgent probe into Soros's American organisation. The Mail on Sunday discovered it put money into the campaign trying to block Brexit. His New York-based Open Society Foundation sent money to the pro-EU Best for Britain group via a London outpost. The billionaire financier, known as the man who broke the Bank of England, is facing possible investigation into nearly £3 million that his foundation channeled into a campaign aimed at bringing down Boris Johnson's Tories. The Tories have called for an urgent electoral commission to probe into George Soros's organisation after the Mail on Sunday discovered that it funneled money into a campaign trying to block Brexit at the ballot box. The development comes after Liberal Democrats in the UK, the Green Party and Plaid Cymru formed a Unite to Remain pact not to stand against each other in 60 seats, to give the best chance of the Remain candidate getting in. BFB describes itself as a fellow traveller, with the alliance which is expected to utilise its data. Hungarian-born Mr. Soros helped build his fortune by betting against sterling on Black Wednesday 1992, causing panic in the then John Major's government, earning him his notoriety. He says, that Soros, that his love for Britain led him to campaign against this tragic mistake of leaving the EU. He said recently that the funds he has given for anti-Brexit activity were not used for partisan or electoral purposes. They were used to educate the British public, unquote. Now I'm just going to add a little comment in here. Mr. Soros, you're not British. Mr. Soros, you don't live in the UK. Mr. Soros, it is none of your darn business what Britain chooses to do. And if you interfere with British politics, Mr. Soros, either directly or indirectly, that's an illegal act, and you should be prosecuted for it, Mr. Soros. There's no escape from that, Mr. Soros. Now, at the same time, there is clear evidence of his activities in Canada, as Soros, who is not a Canadian citizen, has been, and it is believed still to be the case, still advising the disgraced Canadian Prime Minister on a myriad of issues. Not least, of course, is the so-called climate change. Canadians, unfortunately, due mainly to the bias of its political system, putting the emphasis on large urban combines rather than distributing seating in their House of Commons more appropriately and more proportionally to all of Canada's regions, are faced now with a daunting and uncertain future, having re-elected the climate Barbie 57 genders Trudeau. Most likely, that is the result of foreign interference in our elections by Soros and Soros-led and Soros-funded organisations, all for his vision of one world government and one world order, that order being one managed, controlled and directed, either directly or indirectly, by the UN and the UN's Agenda 2030. Canadians, unless they rise up and revolt against their so-called democratically elected leaders, will face a very bleak future, the results of which are already being seen in its economic powerhouse of Ontario and Toronto. For us in Canada, I wonder how much pain we will have to endure before we say enough. Will, for instance, gasoline have to go up 20, 30, 50 or even 100%? Will electricity costs have to double or even treble? I don't know. Will we have to endure food lines like they did for many decades in the former Soviet Union? Will we have to endure the banning of private transport? Will that be enough to make these people rise up and take their country back? I don't honestly know. But one thing is for sure, when they do rise up, no power in Canada will be able to stop them. And those who were complicit and are complicit may well pay the ultimate price. What do you think an unemployed, bankrupt, homeless farmer might do in desperate circumstances if she or he was responsible for their plight? I have to say it paints a very dark future for Canada. But all the while, the PC-ness continues, and while Canadians carry on watching hockey and drinking beer, appearing somewhat oblivious to their oncoming economic oblivion, it seems also that politicians here in Canada are also in the same mindset. Now, it could well be that these folks are in fact mindless automatons. Why? Because they've not been taught history, and that's for a reason, isn't it? And a final thought. History does teach you that if the masses aren't happy, then you as a politician should not be either. Even the Chinese government know that one. You can find more at aradio.wordpress.com, where you can find links to us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Gab, Spotify and email. We're on Spotify under the podcast section. type in Canadian politics with a twist and you'll find us. We are continuing to reach out to you, so please pass these links on to your friends. Please click on the follow button on Spreaker.com. You can listen to all our morning moments at Spreaker.com/A-Radio. EHRADIO, A-Radio. And please click on the like button. Join us Monday, Wednesday and Friday at 11:45 Eastern and tell your friends and pass the word. We only tell the truth, not what the mainstream media want you to know.